It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this course on the Darwinian Revolution. What I want to do in these lectures is to provide you with a good deal of information that will help you understand Darwinian evolution and its implications. Let me say at the outset that the issues here, especially those concerning the implications people have drawn from Darwin's work, are not straightforward and simple. We'll watch them take lots of twists and turns as we follow the debate over time. There's a very good reason why the issues are not simple or superficial. It's because Darwin introduced into Western civilization a profoundly revolutionary message. I've used a commonly heard phrase, the Darwinian Revolution, as the title for this course. But although lots of people talk about the Darwinian Revolution, it's easy to overlook the meaning of those words. The thing about revolutions is that they disturb the status quo. They introduce transformation of a fundamental kind. Otherwise, the disturbance is just a change, or at best a reform. But a true revolution affects foundations, and it does so in a profound way. After Darwin, it was not business as usual for science. It would take a while for the truly revolutionary dimension of Darwin's contribution to be understood. And that's the thing. In my view, there is still confusion about why Darwin is so revolutionary. What Darwin said has not been the problem. That's not terribly difficult to grasp. The basics of the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection are deceptively plain. Oh, to be sure, it has been adjusted when it's been extended into scientific disciplines that weren't around in Darwin's time. For example, molecular biology. It has found new levels of confirmation. But the basic idea that variations well adapted to their environment have a better chance of survival and to reproduce than those that are not, and that over time species change as a result, that's the same. It's the implications of these ideas that cause the confusion. That's because people come to different conclusions about what it means. Darwin himself, of course, also thought about what its implications were. We'll see in a later lecture that there are ways in which the inferences Darwin made from his theory about its wider meaning are different from those that many scientists hold today. Darwin was very much a 19th century Victorian. He hadn't experienced world wars, Holocaust, the prospect of nuclear disaster, or the other horrors unique to the incredibly violent 20th century we somehow all survived. His understanding of his own theory reflected the perspective of the optimism and progressiveness of his time. Once such brutal events as those of the 20th century had taken place, however, a different outlook became more feasible. The crux of the issue that Darwin's theory forced, and continues to force, concerns the question of a larger purpose behind the world of living things, or, for that matter, behind the universe itself. That's it in a nutshell. Before Darwin, no one seriously advocated that the organic world was not subject to a larger purpose. The very existence of natural laws, which scientists had been discovering for some time, suggested to most everyone that the world was subject to the rational order that God had imposed on it. There was, of course, substantial debate about the nature of God, and specifically about the way God related to his creation. But there were very few, if any, genuine atheists who did not believe in some kind of God. The God of Spinoza, Hobbes, David Hume, might have been anything but orthodox, but at least he did exist. After Darwin, this gradually changed. Not right away, but eventually. This is why a physicist like Leonard Susskind chooses not a physicist, but Darwin in the pivotal role where the history of cosmology is concerned. Modern cosmology, says Susskind, really began with Darwin and Wallace. Unlike anyone before them, they provided explanations of our existence that completely rejected supernatural agents. But many people did not feel then, and many people do not feel in our own day, that Darwin necessarily implies atheism. And so the controversy continues. Let me come at why Darwin was so revolutionary from a different direction. Throughout its history, much of humankind, at least in the West, has displayed a desire to have certainty about things. There was a time when people were so certain that no dissent was tolerated at all. A person could be hanged or burned if she or he maintained something contrary to what was accepted as true. This was clearly the case in medieval and early modern times. But even with the development of modern philosophy, in the wake of what we fondly refer to as the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the need for certainty didn't go away. What was it, after all, that Descartes sought? He wanted certainty. He wanted to find something that was absolutely impossible to doubt. He thought he found that in his famous quip, "I think, therefore I am." And then he tried to build on that certainty to get to other conclusions. Or take John Locke. When Locke and the British empiricists zeroed in on sensations, they were trying to find a sure foundation on which to build their philosophical systems. And any number of Western thinkers who have encountered a level of certainty in mathematical relationships have tried to duplicate that certainty in their philosophical systems. I think again here of Hobbes and Spinoza, or of Jakob Fries in Germany. But philosophers have also persuasively argued that where knowledge of the world is concerned, certainty is not among the blessings humans enjoy. The skeptical tradition goes way back, but particularly since the days of David Hume and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, we've had to face the possibility that human reason has its limits. Hume provided a devastating critique of the claims of revelation as a source of truth. But he also undermined the power of induction and causal explanation as means of attaining certainty, and they stand at the heart of scientific explanation. Kant came along and rescued a role for causal explanation, but he did so by limiting it to what he called the phenomenal realm, the things that we can see, hear, touch, taste, smell. Where ultimate questions about reality were concerned, its essential nature, its purpose, or as Kant put it, how nature is in itself. That we will never know. Kant meant that very precisely. That is, metaphysical questions are not matters of knowledge. Cognition has to do only with the realms of the senses, he said. Kant's disciples in the late 19th century noted something else about knowledge, that the causal explanations of science are never final, something the history of science certainly confirms. They change over time, sometimes even radically. One of Kant's followers regarded scientific explanation as simply a means by which we can control nature. That left aside the question of whether scientific explanation was true or not. It was more a question of whether it worked. Well, philosophers in the early 20th century, known as logical positivists, went even further. They acknowledged that the metaphysical positions people hold, while not capable of being true or false, do reveal what most people believe. Metaphysical beliefs are like aesthetic predilections. They're neither right nor wrong, but they do tell us about people's preferences. They're like matters of artistic taste. What's ugly to you might be beautiful to me. That doesn't mean you're right and I'm wrong. We're just different. My father-in-law likes to say, that's why they make chocolate and vanilla, by which he means, hey, people are just different. Some people like Renoir. Some people like Andy Warhol. Some like both. Some people like to think the mind can have independent existence from the material body. Others think that matter in motion is all there is. Metaphysical views, so said these philosophers, are no more significant than showing us the differences in people. So how does all this bear on the historical questions before us? Let's start by acknowledging that certainty was and remains at least hard to come by. But beyond that, we need to be as clear as we can be about what in the debates over evolution fell under the category of metaphysical belief and what qualified as scientific explanation. Some of this is easy, and some isn't. For example, there's that fundamental metaphysical question Darwin forced people to consider, the question of purpose in nature. Many folks believed that the physical universe had a larger purpose into which we plug. We're not here for no reason. Rather, there's a larger meaning to the existence of the universe, and it's relevant to the meaning of our lives. Others, especially those in the 20th century, held the opposite. There's no larger meaning to the physical universe. It is what it is. The only meaning there is in the universe is what we ourselves create. The point is, whichever side of the issue you come down on, or if you have a different take on the physical universe from the one that I just described, or either of those positions, it's not something you have inside knowledge and certainty about, but it's something you believe. People on both sides can feel awe and reverence before nature's mysteries, and all will, of course, use knowledge claims to support their belief, but whether the universe has an intrinsic purpose or not is not something we can determine by running an experiment. A scientific debate is not going to settle the matter. Speaking of scientific debates, let's go back to something I mentioned earlier. Scientific knowledge, when we do acquire it, has a way of changing over time. That, in fact, is one of its strengths. It's self-correcting. Because it's constantly testing its claims, because it continually asks nature to talk back to us, it changes as new information comes in. Scientists pride themselves on not being dogmatic. When they're behaving like scientists, they do change their minds if new evidence gives them reason to. Admittedly, they're only human, and sometimes they become wedded to this theory or that, but eventually they tend to develop a consensus about the meaning of the evidence. It would be a mistake, however, to become too comfortable with any consensus because, as history has shown all too often, we'll come across something new that has a way of reshaping our ideas. Where things become real tricky is when we start asking questions like, does science give us truth? If it's always changing, how could it be giving us truth at any one time? There's one reason why some scientists prefer not to talk about whether a theory is true or not. They prefer to ask whether it explains the data. Final truth, at least, seems to be something that Kant said we couldn't have. We can't know how nature is in the final analysis or in itself. But that doesn't seem quite right either. What about scientific facts? Facts don't change. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. There's no controversy about that. True enough. I'm aware that there are those who say that facts change depending on the context in which they occur. We might think, for example, that looking directly at something is all we need to do to decide what it is. But we're all familiar with optical illusions. That long pole that you use to clean your swimming pool doesn't really bend as it goes under the water. It just looks that way. Well, that one's easy. Here's one that's not. For over a millennium, people in the West took it as a fact that the sun moved across the sky every day. After all, they could see it happen day after day. If anything was certain, that was. But that, too, is an optical illusion. It's the Earth that moves, not the sun. It took a considerable amount of science to correct that fact. But let's concede that factual knowledge is, at least by and large, unproblematical. As someone has said, you can't boil water by putting the pot on an iceberg. It just won't happen. It's just the way it is. Unfortunately, we do get into arguments about what is a fact and what is not. For example, what about the claim, humankind has evolved from primitive forms of life? Well, philosopher of science Michael Ruse has no hesitation to assert that evolution is, as he puts it, fact, 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 in capital letters. But others say that facts must be observable, or in other ways detectable by the senses. No one has ever seen a human or a higher organism evolve. So evolution must be a theory. Now, to say that it's a theory does not mean that we can dismiss it as just a theory, as if it had no compelling power. But if it is a theory, then we do have to concede that it's subject to change. The last word hasn't been spoken. These are the kinds of issues that are involved in determining the meaning of the Darwinian revolution and keep it from being a straightforward or simple matter. Now, much of this course will be devoted to informing you about the developments that have contributed to the overall story. As I've indicated, I believe that Darwin crystallized things in a way that no one before him did. He fundamentally changed the options on the table. He really did introduce a revolution by provoking a brand new way of looking at things. Let me say a bit more about what the new way of looking at things was. Before I tell you what it entailed, let me be clear about what it was not. It was not the idea of evolution. Maybe that surprises you, but the idea that living things had evolved had been around for some time before Darwin. We'll look at the pre-Darwinian notions of evolution in the next few lectures. We'll start in the 17th century, since it nicely provides the background against which evolutionary notions emerged later. Here we'll look at the heritage of received opinion from earlier times, a world history of about 6,000 years with everything pretty much set in stone at the original creation. There were some interesting exceptions to this picture, but the best scholarship of the day rejected them. Then we'll examine 18th century ideas of evolution on the grand scale, take a look at the emerging importance of fossils, and become familiar with German, English, and French evolutionary schemes as we move into the 19th century. These differed in how specific they were, but they included some very well worked out evolutionary systems. By the time we get to Darwin's conversion to evolution, we'll have established that evolution was and had been in the air for some time. So the Darwinian revolution is not that Darwin introduced the idea of evolution. This raises, incidentally, an important clarification we should make in today's debates over evolution, which we'll return to later in the course. Lots of people accepted the idea of evolution. Some very conservative turn-of-the-century theologians, and I mean the turn from the 19th to the 20th century here, accepted that evolution, including the evolution of humans, had occurred. Augustus Strong, a highly regarded Baptist theologian, who authored one of the most important works on systematic theology, 3 volumes between 1907 and 1909. He used the miracle of the wedding at Cana in the New Testament. That's the one where Jesus turned water into wine to make his point. Here's what he said. The wine in the miracle was not water because water had been used in the making of it, nor is man a brute because the brute has made some contributions to his creation. In other words, here is a Bible-honoring Baptist theologian assenting to the idea that God had used evolution to produce human beings. Strong was then and remains today not alone. As we'll see in Lecture 23, some defenders of intelligent design, including one of the founders of the movement, the biochemist Michael Behe, accept that evolution has occurred. So you can see how fraught with complications this issue is. Many of the newspaper articles I've read equate the issue of intelligent design with evolution. It's just not that simple. One of our tasks, then, is going to have to be to stay away from the deliberate simplification of things by those wishing to exploit what we might call soundbite analysis in the defense of their cause. Back to Darwin's achievement. We'll spend some time with Darwin on his way to accepting evolution, but we'll preface that with an examination of why evolution was not at all the majority view as Darwin was growing up. A lot was happening in science, particularly in the new way it was organized. During Darwin's university years, and especially during the time he went on his famous voyage around the world, science was beginning to become professionalized. That entailed the emergence of criteria by which the newly dubbed scientists, that word was coined around 1833, by which these scientists could define what they did as opposed to what in today's parlance would be known as alternative science. There had to be clarity and consensus about what being scientific meant before the idea of alternative science was even possible. Well, lots of folks during the time Darwin was formulating his ideas regarded evolution to be in the same category as phrenology or mesmerism, both extremely popular sciences at the time. We'll take a closer look at this. So evolution was certainly all over the place during Darwin's early years. That means we have to ask, if Darwin's achievement was not to introduce the idea of evolution, then what was it? It was his focus on how evolution occurred. In a word, Darwin came up with a way of explaining how life could evolve without the direct involvement or supervision of a divine agent. It all hung on what he called natural selection, a concept that is utterly simple and at the same time profoundly full of implications. In other words, Darwin provided an option that let nature do the work all by itself. We'll delve into his book to see how he presented it and how it was initially received. You can already see that this would present a challenge to a largely religious age. God and nature would go together easily for most people at the time, as easily as night and day. This is one of the reasons that many historians suggest that atheism really only became a live option in the middle of the 19th century. Prior to that time, there were plenty of people who had moved away from an orthodox view of God, but they still retained the idea of a divine intelligence of some sort. But after Darwin, it became more possible to proclaim a very explicit form of atheism. That might be why one prominent American scientist and historian has said that Darwinism was the greatest engine for atheism ever invented. Of course, at the time, there were plenty of folks who maintained that there were ways of harmonizing natural selection with theism, or that natural selection could not explain everything about evolution. In Lecture 9, we're going to focus on the question of Darwin and religion, where I'll unpack for you exactly what the implications of natural selection are, and we'll sort out how Darwin himself and others at the end of the 19th century grappled with the new religious options. Of course, religion wasn't the only subject to feel the impact of Darwin's revolutionary idea. In fact, one of the greatest effects of Darwin's contribution has a certain irony about it. I've already made the distinction between just the idea of evolution and the question of how it occurred. Darwin's achievement, once again, was not to introduce the idea of evolution. His genius was to figure out a novel explanation of how and why it occurred. But, and here's the irony, while Darwin's explanation of how evolution occurred did not fare very well in the late 19th century, the idea of evolution did. One of the greatest effects of Darwin's origin was to gain much greater acceptance for the notion that evolution was real and had occurred than it had ever enjoyed before. Sure, it had been around for a while, but it was not widely accepted. Prior to Darwin, that is. After Darwin, more and more people began to accept the idea of evolution. It became much more possible to say that you believed in evolution without being immediately looked at as if you were uneducated. That's not to say that everyone did. There were plenty of people who resisted evolution in the late 19th century, and that's continued to our own day. But after Darwin, evolution was becoming more and more acceptable, especially among certain parts of society. Beginning in Lecture 10, we'll look at how this new appreciation for evolution showed itself in late 19th century culture. It had an impact on social thought, on political thought, on literature, on science itself, and on religious thought. Most of the ways it affected 19th century culture were due simply to the new emphasis on evolution. Occasionally, an impact due to the uniqueness of natural selection appeared, though these are harder to spot. We'll look at some of the reasons why Darwin's idea of natural selection did not fare well, what the challenges were for his theory, and why it fell into disfavor for a time. There were a number of contexts in which natural selection was challenged. For example, Herbert Spencer, the English writer and philosopher, thought it had to be subordinated to a more explicitly purposeful evolution if it was to form the basis for social philosophy. Numerous scientists criticized it for various technical reasons, which we'll examine. Some of these involved the science of heredity, a relatively new focus for scientists. These problems were very difficult, not easily solved. Scientific objections to natural selection, like those stemming from its relevance to heredity, formed one of the main stumbling blocks that Darwin faced. Of course, a considerable number of folks, both scientists and lay people, either just didn't grasp what natural selection was, or if they did, they downplayed it. Some even dismissed it out of hand. Many, as I mentioned earlier, insisted on talking about Darwin as if he were just another natural philosopher pushing the idea of evolution. People in the late 19th century, like others since, didn't always grasp the fact that the idea of evolution was one thing and Darwin's notion of natural selection was another, a means of explaining how evolution occurred. As a result, people then, as people still today, equated Darwin's theory with evolution. But natural selection was far more threatening to the goal-oriented culture of the Victorian era than was the idea of evolution alone. It's quite possible to accept the idea of evolution and remain committed to transcendent goals, as we saw with Augustus Strong. You can be very religiously committed and still accept the reality of evolution, although perhaps it requires a certain flexibility that most traditional religious views disallow. It's a lot harder to accept the idea of natural selection and remain religious in any kind of traditional way. That may sound presumptuous to some of you, since you see yourselves as Darwinians and religious at the same time. So, of course, I'm going to have to explain myself in this point, and you can see if you agree or don't agree. So we'll watch as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection took it on the chin in the late 19th century. If there was a low point for natural selection, it might have been at the very time when the work of the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel was rediscovered around the turn of the 20th century. We'll examine why that was, and we'll end the first half of the course with natural selection at its nadir. The fact is that all these developments, some of them off in the narrow world of the microbiologist, eventually would contribute to the revival of Darwin's theory of natural selection. We'll start the second half of the course there, when the uniqueness of natural selection could no longer be ignored. And in this second part, we'll see how new scientific developments laid the groundwork for a recovery of Darwin's original emphasis on the natural selection of small variations. That would take some time, but eventually scientists brought together evidence from different disciplines like population genetics and molecular biology to create an evolutionary synthesis. We'll watch that happen. At the same time all this was going on, a lot was happening in the wider culture where evolution was concerned. The question of human evolution took center stage, not only because of new fossil discoveries, but also because of the rise of American fundamentalism. The Scopes trial was but the beginning of a series of court cases involving evolution over the 20th century. And the issue of natural selection ran afoul of the Soviet political system when it was labeled as a decadent bourgeois Western idea. Finally, we'll review the emergence of creationism and intelligent design in an attempt to bring us up to more recent debates. Here, our goal will be to try to understand why the debates take the shape they have. So the 20th century presented its own challenges and opportunities for Darwinian theory and for its reception in the broader culture. Here it could no longer be equated with the idea of evolution alone, as if what Darwin had said had already been said before him by many others. No, now it was natural selection that was the focus. And that, in my opinion, is what forces the issue today. Sure, there are those who still want to talk about natural selection as if it means nothing more than that higher life forms have evolved from lower ones. But by and large, that is not where the real issue lies. A lot of people are comfortable with the idea of evolution. How many are equally comfortable with natural selection is another matter. But that's all down the road. In our next lecture, we'll look at the way it used to be. So let me say what my hope is as we set out on this tour. My goal for this course is to give you a lot of information that will be helpful to you as you continue thinking about what the Darwinian revolution was in the past and continues to be in the present.